growing up in North New Jersey in the 1980s was a time where I watched the promise of the Great Migration of my, my relatives, my grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers are from South Carolina, were from South Carolina, and to watch their generation. My father's father was a truck driver for many years, and he was a community activist. He actually was one of the founding members of the People's Organization for Progress
Okay.
with Larry Ham.
Yeah, Larry Ham. Yeah.
Yeah, my relatives went to school with Larry Ham in New York. And my other grandfather, my mother's father, who was actually 20 years older than him, he worked for Thomas Edison, and he also had a painting company.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that generation. Those are my grandparents. And then to see some of the struggles, my father, he met an early grave at the age of 34 by being stabbed to death. And my grandmother said, I would have rather him be dead than go to jail. Because if he wasn't killed, he would have been in jail. And it offended me so much. And then to have both of my mother's brothers, before they turned 60, one before he turned 50, because of health problems and, drug abuse that was rampant in the 1980s. I mean, when I look back on all of those adults that were rearing us, taking us to school, many of them were indulging in recreational drug use. And it's something that I grew up being very ashamed of. So when I wrote this synopsis, and I'm just going to read it straight through, there's some survivor's guilt that's there as a man of color who has an uncle that's a year and a half older than me, who's been incarcerated many times, but we grew up in the same room at my grandmother's house. And here I am standing here at, on the Upper West Side at the Ideal School. And it's like, okay, but wait a minute, how does this happen? How do you grow up in the same house and have this happen? So when you hear my tone when I'm reading this, I'm coming from that place. And it's not to offend, but it's really just, I hope that you can understand this is something I live. This is something that I cannot escape from. So mass incarceration as a caste system, or case system, it's painfully apparent that the current case system, mass incarceration against poor people of color, is reminiscent of the actual Jim Crow era and even slavery. While there are indeed similarities between them, the initial purpose of each system perpetuated by elite whites in power looking to shift resentments of poor whites to blacks and other minority groups. There are staunch differences that need to be fully dissected, defined, and made visible in a society that has become colorblind, thus rendering an epidemic of apathy and entitlement amongst more than just one racial group. So we go on to bootstraps myths. It's almost trite for a person of color not to discern where bootstraps rhetoric comes from. Examples of this philosophy run rampant within privileged elite blacks that are a big part of the problem than many of us like to admit. Black people of influence spanning from Booker T. Washington, Bill Cosby, Don Lemon, and even President Barack Obama have been known to admonish less than desirable traits and a lack of quality of life that is inaccurately blamed on the victims of the case system of the day. One cannot simply pull his pants up if the environment he is in fosters the mentality that this fashion trend and expression stems from. The environment of many urban poor communities is largely due to a disproportionate amount of the access, denial of resources to those who need it the most. This includes, but is not limited to, high quality education, viable commerce, opportunities for economic growth, stability, and sustainability, proper family planning, and many of the other basics needed for human life to exist at its very best. Where there is a lack of resources for people to meet their basic needs, you will have a lower quality of life. This theorem is as simple as a basic mathematical equation. And then piggybacking off of previous chapters, I love this one because if you didn't know, I was on American Idol 10 years ago, this January. And the media is such a big part of perpetuating the imagery and the expectations amongst people of all groups. And like was said, Jasmine and Mike said, I saw that Flavor of Love, and I'm looking at Flavor Flav, and I'm looking at all the women around him. I'm like, that's a pimp and prostitutes. it's glorifying, whoredom and crime. If you just look at the imagery, so it goes beyond the minstrel aspects. It attaches the criminality to the element of the images. There's also an abhorrent amount of media that reinforces these stereotypes and lowers the standard of perceived and actualized expectations of achievement, especially in groups of color. Posing questions like former model Tyra Banks asked, "Where are all the good black men?" She asked this question on her show back in like 2006. And, I was like, okay, Tyra, really? Like, girl, what are you talking about? Where are all the black men? It sends a message that there's a problem of a shortage of men of color in a discriminatorily heteronormative sense, mind you, which I'm staunchly against, that can simply be solved with pulling up of one's pants and good morals. You must go to the source of where the conditions of poor black America stem from. The system does not support the advancement of poor blacks, and it never has. So this is one of my favorites, is like I said, I grew up in the 80s, Reagan's war on drugs, and that could be and or versus drunk drivers. Another disturbing and confusing facet of this new case system of mass incarceration is how President Ronald Reagan's 1980s war on drugs was used to attach the bulk of convicted crimes to people of color, particularly black men. There were mandates placed on harsh convictions of individuals charged with possession of drugs and other nonviolent crimes, while those who were committing manslaughter in the most reckless of ways through drunk driving were given misdemeanors laden with opportunities to rehabilitate and maintain within the fabric of mainstream America. This remains a shining and telling example of how elite whites were able to shift the anger, frustration, intentionally purported economic woes, and resentments of poor whites to place the blame on criminals, which, when you examine the demographics of the American prison system, are over 90% people of color, while trying to sweep DUIs and DWIs, predominantly from intoxicated white males, under the rug. So there's a simile here with mass incarceration. Then you go back to Jim Crow, and you go back to slavery. If you turn back the pages of history, there have been many similarities between mass incarceration, Jim Crow, and slavery. Firstly, the only way that systems like this can be sustained is through what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. refers to as sincere ignorance in the form of colorblindness and racial apathy. When the plights of a targeted group take place in areas that remain unseen by people of privilege, and privileges are found in every racial group, there is no human connection to those who are suffering. GI Bills, white flight during the 50s and 60s, zoning laws, segregation mandates from Jim Crow era policies, and the fear of the Ku Klux Klan served as the unshakable bridge between antebellum and the post-Vietnam era. There's always been a maintenance of superiority of whites because the laws have been set up and, most importantly, enforced in ways that give lenience to whites while confining and permanently branding blacks as felons, thus shutting them out from the basic rights and freedoms of mainstream American society. You can't say all of that without talking about the elitism that exists in all races, especially black elitism, and how close it is to white apathy. Other examples of similarities can be found in the history of the attitudes of black elites who capitalized on the shame and stigma of slavery to support initiatives to suppress the voices of oppressed, economically marginalized, and undereducated blacks. One way that this took place was through preventing poor blacks from voting. From a possible literacy test to poll taxes, every legal obstacle was cemented so that, although blacks were counted in the populace to secure more electoral power, their interests would not only be ignored but also denied. Many black elitists supported these laws, largely based on the shame of being oppressed, but also to secure their own illusionary place in society, outside of and away from the slums and ghettos that they originated from. This stems from a desperation of slave owners, which were the original models of this kind of behaviors that we have found ourselves entrenched in. It has to be understood that, first and foremost, the ultimate root of these practices, starting from slavery, is not based on fundamental attitudes about races, but something that does not practice discrimination, and that is greed. Greed of slave owners wanting to not only thrive, but also prosper during times of extreme conditions in a then new America. Religion and fear were used to coerce blacks into accepting their place as the property of whites. This is the same capitalist greed that drives white elite lawmakers to bait and switch on their poorer, white, poor counterparts. And lastly, it's just a synopsis, and we talk about exploitation and slavery, subordination during the Jim Crow era, and marginalization through this mass incarceration era. When you're exploited, at least you have a purpose. So that was slavery. And then when you are subordinate, you still have a purpose, but it's usually as a stepping tool to boost the egos and the perceptive safeties of other people. But when you're marginalized, that's being wiped out. And that's what mass incarceration is societally imposing upon people who are attached to a life of crime or perceived lives of crime, but they're just simply convicted of felonies. As a result of these legal yet discriminatory practices of lawmaking and enforcement, the results are larger numbers of young black men with a criminal history that are highly disproportionate to those of other races, especially whites. I can attest to this because many of the young men that were my age on my block in New Jersey have been incarcerated. And as years go on, I can count less and less of the people that I grew up with that have not been incarcerated. And as an educator, I realize that the only difference that I can make is by impacting a newer generation and really speaking my truth and walking out of the shame, because it's that shame of being connected to those who happen to make some choices. Sometimes many of us have made some of the same choices, but because of my light skin and my quote-unquote good hair, I didn't get pulled over by the police, but my darker skinned cousin did. And it's that real. So when you say the struggle is real, it is really real. Thank you.
Oh,